I knew this assignment was strange from the minute I stepped onto the transport boat. 3 days ago, the military flight dropped me on some nameless island with barely a landing strip. Then a small patrol boat picked me up for the 4-hour journey to what they called Platform Charlie. No explanation beyond the basics. I'd be stationed with 5 other men to guard a weather monitoring buoy. Seemed like overkill to post 6 trained soldiers for what sounded like maintenance duty, but orders were orders. The platform itself was nothing special. A gray metal structure about 40 feet square, rising 15 feet above the ocean surface. 2 levels, the lower one for storage and equipment, the upper for living quarters and the monitoring station. The whole thing sat on massive pylons anchored to the seabed somewhere in the emptiness of the Pacific. I tried asking our commanding officer, Sergeant Arnold, about the real purpose of our assignment, but his answer never changed. The buoy collects atmospheric and oceanographic data. Your job is to protect it and perform regular inspections. My first 2 days passed in mindless routine. I met the other guys. Mark Johnson and Stephen Brown would be on rotation with me, while Christopher Davis and Henry Williams took the opposite shift. They'd all arrived just days before me, except for Arnold, who'd been here 3 months already. Tonight was my first night shift. I sat in the small galley with Mark and Stephen as Arnold briefed us on inspection procedures. "You'll row out every 6 hours to check the buoy's physical condition," Arnold explained, pointing to a small metal rowboat tied to the platform. "Visual inspections only. Don't touch any of the equipment unless directly ordered." "Why can't we use the motorboat?" I asked. "Noise pollution affects the readings," Arnold said flatly. "Any other questions, Martinez?" I shook my head. "Good. I'll see you at 600. Mark slapped my shoulder after Arnold left. "Don't worry about it. The rowing's not bad unless the water gets choppy." Stephen nodded. "We take turns. You can handle the first one at midnight." I spent the first few hours of our shift watching Mark and Stephen go through the motions, checking gauges, recording numbers in logbooks, and scanning the empty horizon with binoculars. Around midnight, I rowed out to the buoy as instructed. The water was calm, making the task easier than expected. The buoy itself was larger than I initially thought, about 10 feet tall, with various sensors and equipment attached to its red-painted metal frame. I circled it twice, keeping my distance as ordered, then rowed back to report that everything looked normal. "Nice work," Mark said, checking off something on his clipboard. "Next inspection at 6, but we have the equipment check at 2. The hours crawled by. I familiarized myself with the platform layout, practiced emergency procedures, and tried to stay awake. At 1:30, Stephen made coffee while Mark pulled out the equipment checklist. "Time to get our hands dirty," Mark said, motioning for me to follow him to the lower level. We checked safety equipment, communications gear, and backup systems. By 2, we were back on deck, ready for another buoy inspection. "I'll row this time," Mark offered. "Stephen can keep an eye on things from here. You coming with me, Martinez?" I nodded and climbed into the boat with him. The night was eerily still, with no moon and only stars providing any light. The platform's floodlights illuminated the immediate area, but beyond that was pure darkness. As Mark rowed, I watched our dim flashlight beams bounce across the black water. "How long have you been stationed here?" I asked. 2 weeks, Mark replied, rowing steadily. "Same as Steve. It's not a bad gig once you get used to it. Boring as hell, but easy work." We reached the buoy and started our inspection. Mark rowed us in a circle around it while I shined my flashlight over its surface. The buoy bobbed gently in the calm water, its sensors blinking with tiny red and green lights. We were about halfway through our circuit when Mark stopped rowing. "Wait," he whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. "Do you see that?" I followed his gaze out into the darkness. At first I saw nothing but black ocean meeting black sky. Then I spotted it, a pale shape moving across the water's surface, maybe 100 yards out. "What is that?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Mark shook his head. "Not sure. Could be debris." But it wasn't debris. As it moved closer, the shape took form. A woman in tattered white clothing, her long, pale hair hanging in wet strands around her face. The impossible part wasn't her appearance, but the fact that she was walking directly on top of the water, moving toward us with steady steps. "That's not possible," I breathed. Mark grabbed the radio. "Steve, we've got something out here. Some kind of person on the water." The radio crackled. "Say again? A person?" "Affirmative. A woman walking on the water's surface, heading straight for the buoy." I watched, unable to look away as the figure approached. She stopped about 20 yards from us, her eyes fixed on our position. Then she spoke. A stream of sounds unlike any language I'd ever heard, harsh and fluid at the same time. Mark stood up in the boat, causing it to rock. "Hello? Can you understand me? Who are you?" The woman gestured toward the buoy, speaking again in that strange language. Her movements were jerky, unnatural. I noticed her skin wasn't just pale. It was white, like bleached bone, with a faint glow that seemed to come from within. "Mark, I don't think we should—" Before I could finish, the woman took another step forward. Mark instinctively stepped back, nearly tipping our small boat. "Steve," I called into the radio. "Start the motor on the patrol boat. We're coming back now." "Already on it," Stephen replied, his voice tense. Mark sat down and grabbed the oars, turning us back toward the platform. I kept my eyes on the woman, who watched us retreat for a moment before continuing her approach toward the buoy. The patrol boat's engine roared to life as Stephen brought it alongside the platform. Mark rowed faster, but when I looked back, the woman had changed direction. She was now following us, her pace increasing until she was moving faster than we could row. "She's following us," I told Mark, who was too focused on rowing to look back. "Almost there," he grunted. Stephen had the patrol boat ready when we reached the platform. We scrambled aboard, and he immediately opened the throttle, circling back to retrieve our rowboat. "Where is she?" Stephen asked, scanning the water. I pointed toward the platform. "There!" The woman was already climbing the metal ladder that led from the water to the deck. Her movements were quick and spider-like, hands and feet finding purchase on the slick metal with unnatural ease. "We need to get back," Mark said. Stephen pushed the engine to full power, bringing us back to the platform in seconds. By the time we tied off the boat, the woman had disappeared onto the deck above. "We should call the sergeant," I suggested, but Mark was already moving toward the ladder. "First, we need to secure that thing," he said. "Whatever it is, it shouldn't be here." We climbed up after him, Stephen close behind me. The deck was empty when we reached it, the floodlights casting harsh shadows across the metal surface. "Where did she go?" Stephen whispered. Mark pointed toward the equipment shed. "The door's open." We approached cautiously. Mark pulled his sidearm, something I hadn't even thought to do, and pushed the door wider with his foot. "Hello?" he called. "We need you to identify yourself." No response. Mark stepped inside, gun first. Stephen and I followed, fumbling for the light switch. The fluorescent lights flickered on, revealing the cramped interior of the shed. Tools lined the walls, and crates of equipment filled most of the floor space. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then Mark gasped. The woman stood in the far corner, her body unnaturally still. Up close, she looked even less human. Her skin had a translucent quality, like wax paper stretched over bones. Her eyes were black pools without whites or irises. "Ma'am, you need to identify yourself," Mark said, his voice steady despite the situation. The woman tilted her head, studying him with those empty eyes. Then she spoke again in that strange language, taking a step forward. "Stay back," Mark warned, raising his gun. She ignored him, continuing her approach. Mark fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The woman didn't even flinch. "Mark, let's get out of here," Stephen urged, grabbing his arm. But Mark stood his ground. "This is a restricted military installation. You need to stop and identify yourself." The woman lunged forward with impossible speed. Before Mark could react, she had her hand on his face. I watched in horror as Mark's skin instantly turned gray, his eyes widening in shock. He didn't even have time to scream before his body crumpled to the floor. Stephen fired 3 shots into the woman's chest. The bullets seemed to pass through her without effect. She turned her attention to him next, reaching out with that same deadly hand. "Run!" I shouted. But Stephen was frozen in place. The woman touched Stephen's face, and the same horrific transformation occurred, his skin graying and withering as if all life was sucked out in an instant. His body fell next to Mark's, both men now looking like dried husks. I backed toward the door, but the woman blocked my escape route, her black eyes fixed on me as she stepped over the bodies of my teammates. My mind raced. Bullets hadn't worked. Running wasn't an option. I needed a weapon. Something different. I spotted a toolbox on the workbench beside me and grabbed the first thing my hand found, a screwdriver. The woman continued her approach, speaking those strange words again. The screwdriver felt useless in my hand. In desperation, I fled deeper into the shed, knocking over crates to slow her pursuit. I burst through the back door, which led to the galley. My eyes darted around the small kitchen space, looking for anything that might help. The knife block. I grabbed the largest knife just as the woman entered the galley. She moved with that same unnatural speed, closing the distance between us in seconds. I had one chance. As her hand reached for my face, I ducked under her arm and drove the knife upward with all my strength, aiming for her head. The blade connected with her left eye, sinking deep into the socket. The woman froze. A high-pitched noise filled the room, like a scream but not human. Her body began to glow brighter, the light pouring from her mouth and the wound in her eye. I stumbled backward, shielding my face as the light grew blinding. Then came a flash so intense it felt like being hit by lightning. When my vision cleared, the woman was gone. The knife clattered to the floor where she had stood. I stood alone in the galley, gasping for breath. My hands shook as I picked up the knife. The blade was clean, not a trace of blood or any other fluid. Moving on unsteady legs, I returned to the equipment shed. Mark and Stephen's bodies remained where they had fallen, their skin gray and shriveled like ancient mummies. Their eyes were open, showing only white orbs drained of color. I sank to my knees beside them, unable to process what I'd just witnessed. My two teammates, men I'd barely known for 3 days, now lay dead from something I couldn't explain. A woman who walked on water, who couldn't be harmed by bullets, who killed with a touch. I didn't know how long I sat there before I realized I needed to report what happened. Sergeant Arnold needed to know. Everyone needed to know about the thing that had come from the ocean. But as I looked at the knife in my hand and the bodies on the floor, a terrible thought occurred to me. Would anyone believe me? I didn't sleep. After finding the bodies of Mark and Stephen, I stayed in the galley, clutching the knife and watching the door until the first hint of gray light crept across the sky. Every noise, the creak of metal, the slap of waves against the platform, sent adrenaline coursing through my body. When I judged it was late enough, I made my way to Sergeant Arnold's quarters and knocked. He answered almost immediately, already dressed in his uniform as if he'd been awake for hours. "Martinez, what is it?" The word stuck in my throat. How could I possibly explain what had happened? "Sir, there's been an incident. Mark and Stephen are dead." Arnold's face remained impressively blank. "Show me." I led him to the equipment shed where the bodies still lay. Arnold knelt beside them, examining their gray, withered skin without touching them. His lack of shock told me everything. "You've seen this before," I said. Arnold stood up. "Tell me exactly what happened." I recounted the night's events. The woman on the water, her attack, how the knife to her eye had made her disappear. Throughout my explanation, Arnold's expression never changed. When I finished, he nodded once. "You did well to survive, Martinez. You knew this could happen. It wasn't a question." Arnold checked his watch. "Get Williams and Davis up here. We need to dispose of the bodies." "Dispose of them? Shouldn't we call this in? Get a medical team out here?" "That's not how we handle this situation." His tone left no room for argument. "Get the others." I found Henry and Christopher still asleep in their bunks. Their shift wasn't supposed to start for hours, but I shook them awake anyway. "Sergeant needs you both. Now. Something's happened." Christopher rubbed his eyes. "What's going on?" "Mark and Stephen are dead." That got them moving. They followed me back to the equipment shed where Arnold was wrapping the bodies in tarp. "Williams, Davis, help me carry these to the east side," Arnold ordered. Christopher paled. "Sir, what happened to them?" "Equipment malfunction, electrical discharge. Now grab his legs." I watched as the three of them carried Mark's body out to the deck. Arnold was lying, and from the looks on their faces, Henry and Christopher knew it too, but they followed orders. I helped them with Stephen's body next. We carried both to the edge of the platform where the waves crashed against the metal pylons. Arnold instructed us to secure weights to the tarps. "Standard procedure for remote stations," he explained as we worked. "Medical evacuation isn't possible. Bodies go overboard." Christopher looked sick. "Shouldn't we at least read something? Say some words?" Arnold paused. "You've got 2 minutes." Christopher stammered through a quick prayer while Henry stood silently beside him. I couldn't take my eyes off the tarp-wrapped bundles that had been my teammates just hours before. When Christopher finished, Arnold nodded and we tipped the bodies over the edge. They hit the water with twin splashes and sank quickly beneath the waves. Report to the mess in 2 hours, Arnold said, turning away. We'll discuss reassignments then. I watched him walk back toward the main structure, his back straight as if we hadn't just dumped 2 bodies into the ocean. What really happened? Christopher asked me once Arnold was out of earshot. I shook my head. You wouldn't believe me. Try us, Henry said. I almost told them everything, but something in Arnold's demeanor had warned me to keep quiet until I understood more about what was happening here. Later, I promised. After we talked to the sergeant. 2 hours later, we gathered in the small mess hall. Arnold arrived with a folder tucked under his arm. As of now, we're operating with a reduced crew, he began. Martinez, you'll work exclusively with Williams and Davis from now on. Your shift starts tomorrow at 2000 hours. Tomorrow night? I couldn't hide my disbelief. After what happened, Arnold ignored my protest and pulled a laminated card from his folder, sliding it across the table to me. Memorize these, all of you. I picked up the card. It contained 4 numbered rules, typed in bold letters. 1. Do not acknowledge, speak to, or interact with any unidentified figure approaching the buoy or platform. 2. Maintain minimum distance of 20 feet from any unidentified figure at all times. 3. Prevent any unidentified figure from entering living quarters or control room. 4. If touched or spoken to directly by an unidentified figure, use your sidearm on yourself immediately. I read the rules twice, trying to process the implications, especially Rule 4. Kill ourselves? I looked up at Arnold. That's your protocol? It's more merciful than the alternative. Arnold's voice was flat. You survived because you acted quickly, Martinez. Most don't get that chance. What are these things? Christopher asked, reading over my shoulder. And why are we guarding a weather buoy from them? Arnold took the card back and handed identical copies to Christopher and Henry. The buoy is not a weather station. Its purpose is classified, but its continuous operation is essential to national security. That's not an answer, I said. It's all you're getting for now. Arnold tapped the laminated card. These rules exist because they work. They've been developed through experience. Follow them and you might survive your rotation here. Might? Henry's voice cracked slightly. This situation will likely repeat itself. Arnold continued as if Henry hadn't spoken. The 3 of you need to work together. Trust each other. And above all, follow these rules without hesitation. How long have you known about these things? I asked. Arnold's eyes met mine. Long enough to know the rules work. And you didn't think to warn us before sending us out there? Would you have believed me? He looked around the table. Would any of you have taken it seriously if I'd told you what was out there? None of us answered. He was right. I would have thought he was pulling some kind of sick joke on the new guys. Your rotation starts tomorrow night, Arnold repeated, standing up. I suggest you spend today resting and memorizing those rules. Dismissed. After he left, the 3 of us sat in silence for several minutes. This is insane, Christopher finally said. They can't expect us to just continue like nothing happened. They can, and they do, I replied. Henry stared at his rule card. What did you see out there, Martinez? What killed them? I told them everything. The woman walking on water, her impossible speed, the way Mark and Stephen had died when she touched them. I described stabbing her in the eye and the blinding flash when she disappeared. You're saying it's some kind of, what, ghost? Christopher asked when I finished. I don't know what it was, I admitted. But Sergeant Arnold does. He wasn't surprised at all. Maybe we should request a transfer, Henry suggested. Tell them we're not equipped for this kind of mission. I shook my head. You saw how Arnold handled it. This is clearly something they don't want getting out. I doubt they'd let us leave just because we're scared. We spent the next hour discussing our options, which were few. In the end, we agreed to stick together and follow the rules, at least until we figured out what was really happening. After lunch, I took my rule card and a pair of binoculars to the observation deck. I needed some time alone to process everything. The platform felt different now, knowing what lurked in the surrounding waters. I trained the binoculars on the buoy, studying it with new interest. What was it really monitoring? Arnold had said its purpose was classified, but it clearly had something to do with the entity I'd encountered. As I watched, I noticed something unusual about the water surrounding the buoy. While the rest of the ocean surface rippled in normal patterns with the wind, the area immediately around the buoy moved differently. Subtle circular ripples spread outward from its base, even though the sea was relatively calm. It was as if something beneath the surface was disturbing the water in a regular pattern. I lowered the binoculars and rubbed my eyes. Sleep deprivation was making it hard to focus. But when I looked again, the strange movement was still there, a rhythmic disturbance that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the deck, alternating between studying the rules and observing the buoy. The rules were simple enough to memorize, but their implications were troubling. They offered no explanation, no context, just stark instructions for survival, and the fourth rule haunted me. What was so terrible about being touched that death was preferable? I had seen what happened to Mark and Stephen, how their bodies had withered in seconds, but Arnold's rule suggested there were worse outcomes than immediate death. The thought sent a chill through me despite the warm afternoon sun. By evening, exhaustion finally overcame my anxiety. I returned to the quarters I had shared with Mark and Stephen, now eerily empty. Their personal items still sat on their bunks. Stephen's dog-eared paperback, Mark's framed photo of a smiling woman. Tomorrow, I supposed, those things would be packed away like their bodies had been. I lay down on my bunk and closed my eyes, the laminated rule card clutched in my hand. In 48 hours, I would be back on night shift, staring out at the dark water, knowing what waited there. For now, though, I needed rest. And maybe, if I was lucky, I wouldn't dream of pale hands reaching for my face. I hadn't slept well in the 48 hours since we'd tipped Mark and Stephen's weighted bodies into the ocean. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that woman's bone-white face or the way my teammates had withered at her touch. The laminated rule card stayed in my pocket, its edges already softening from how often I'd pulled it out to read it again. The evening sky had turned a deep purple by the time I arrived at the main monitoring station to begin my shift. Christopher was already there, checking equipment readings with mechanical efficiency. Henry stood near the radar display, his back to the door. "Evening," I said, setting my coffee mug on the counter. Christopher nodded in my direction, but Henry didn't respond or turn around. I moved to my station and pulled out the logbook, flipping to the most recent entry. The numbers were written in Henry's handwriting, but something about them looked off, too perfect, each digit formed with identical pressure. "Everything quiet today?" I asked, directing the question at both of them. "Standard operations," Christopher replied. "Buoy readings normal." Henry finally turned. "Yes, normal." His voice came out flat, the words clipped at the edges. Something about his face made my skin crawl. He was looking in my general direction but not quite meeting my eyes. His expression stayed fixed, mouth set in what resembled a smile but didn't quite make it. "You feeling okay, Henry?" I asked. He blinked, the movement deliberate and slow. "Yes, I am fine." Christopher tapped a few keys on the monitoring console. "He's been like that since yesterday morning. Figured he's still processing what happened to Mark and Stephen." I nodded but kept watching Henry, who had turned back to the radar screen. Every few seconds, his right hand would rise to touch his own face, fingers tracing his cheekbone, then jawline, as if checking that everything was still in place. "Time for perimeter check," Christopher announced, grabbing his jacket. "You coming, Martinez?" "Yeah." "Henry too?" Henry turned at the sound of his name. "I will accompany you." The three of us stepped outside onto the metal deck. The platform swayed gently with the waves, a constant rolling motion that took days to get used to. Christopher stumbled slightly as we crossed to the east side. Normal behavior for someone still adjusting to life on the water. Henry didn't stumble once. His movements had a precise quality, each step placed with calculated accuracy that adjusted perfectly to the platform's motion. I watched him walk ahead of us, noting how he never grabbed the railing for support, never hesitated when the deck shifted unexpectedly. "When did you say he started acting weird?" I asked Christopher quietly. "Yesterday morning. He missed breakfast, then showed up for shift change acting. Off. Barely talked during our entire shift." Arnold noticed too. We reached the equipment shed where Mark and Stephen had died. Henry walked straight to the replacement parts cabinet and pulled out the inspection checklist without having to search for it. "You know where everything is now?" I asked casually. Henry paused, his hand still on the cabinet door. "Yes, I learned the layout. Pretty quick. Took me days to figure out where stuff was kept. I have good memory," he replied, his voice empty of any pride or humor. Christopher glanced at me with raised eyebrows but said nothing. We continued our inspection, checking fuel levels, backup generators, and communications equipment. Henry moved through the tasks with robotic efficiency, never asking for help or clarification. For someone who'd arrived at the outpost only 5 days ago, 2 days after me, his familiarity with the system seemed impossible. Back in the monitoring station, I took my position at the main console while Christopher checked the night vision cameras. Henry sat at the communications desk, staring at the radio equipment. "So, Henry," I said, keeping my tone casual, "you were telling me about your hometown the other day, Minnesota, right?" Henry's fingers stopped moving over the radio dials. "Iowa," I frowned. "You sure? I remember you saying something about ice fishing on Lake Superior." "Yes, Iowa, near Lake Superior." Christopher looked up from his station. "Lake Superior doesn't border Iowa, man." Henry's face remained blank for several seconds, then he gave that not quite right smile again. "I meant Michigan. I am from Michigan." "But you said your family had a farm," I pressed. "Corn and soybeans, you said." "Yes, farm in Michigan. Corn." 3 days ago, Henry had spent nearly an hour telling stories about growing up on his family's farm in central Wisconsin, describing his brothers and the trouble they'd get into. He'd been animated, full of specific details about county fairs and his mother's cooking. The man sitting across from me now couldn't even keep his home state straight. For the next few hours, I watched Henry while pretending to focus on my work. He barely moved except to perform necessary tasks. And when he did, it was with that same unnerving precision. Twice I caught him studying Christopher's movements with intense concentration, as if memorizing how a human should act. Around midnight, I made an excuse to check the water filtration system on the lower level. We'd been having issues with the drinking water tasting metallic, I explained. Christopher nodded, while Henry simply watched me leave. The lower level was dimly lit and hummed with machinery. The water filtration system sat in the far corner, a bulky arrangement of tanks and pipes that processed seawater for our use. I checked the gauges and filters, finding nothing unusual. As I was about to head back upstairs, I noticed a dark smudge on the floor behind the main tank. Crouching down, I shined my flashlight into the narrow gap between the tank and the wall. Something was wedged in the space. Fabric, maybe, or... The beam of light caught a pale hand. My heart jumped as I scrambled backward, then forced myself to look again. Moving to the side of the tank, I could see what had been hidden there. A body, crammed into the tight space in an unnatural position. Henry's body. His face had that same gray, withered look I'd seen on Mark and Steven. Skin pulled tight over bone, eyes open but clouded white. He wore the same clothes as the Henry upstairs, down to the faded blue t-shirt under his uniform shirt. I backed away, my hand already reaching for my radio. "Christopher," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady. "Get Sergeant Arnold and come to the filtration system. Now. Don't tell Henry where you're going." "What's wrong?" Christopher asked. "Just do it, and be careful." I waited with my back against the wall, eyes fixed on the narrow access corridor that led to the stairs. If the thing pretending to be Henry came down before Christopher and Arnold arrived, heavy footsteps on the metal stairs announced their arrival less than 2 minutes later. Christopher appeared first, followed by Arnold, both looking tense. "What is it, Martinez?" Arnold demanded. I pointed toward the filtration tank. "The real Henry's back there, dead." Arnold pushed past me, pulling out his flashlight to examine the body without touching it. Christopher stayed back, his face going pale as he understood the implications. "But if that's Henry, then who's upstairs?" I finished for him. "The same thing that killed Mark and Steven, I think. Only now it's wearing Henry's face." Arnold straightened up, his expression grim. "It's taken his form." "You've seen this before?" I asked. "Not exactly like this." Arnold kept his voice low. "The entity has never successfully mimicked someone before. This is new." Christopher pressed his back against the wall, looking up toward the ceiling. "So that thing up there has been with us for at least a day," I said. "Probably since yesterday morning when you noticed Henry acting strange." Arnold checked his sidearm, making sure it was loaded. "This complicates things. Davis, I want you to stay here and guard the body. Don't let anything near it. Martinez, you're with me. We need to search the entire outpost." "And if we find it?" I asked. "We follow protocols," Arnold replied. but the slight hesitation in his voice told me our protocols might not cover this situation. We returned to the upper level cautiously, but the monitoring station was empty. The Henry impostor was gone. "When did it leave?" Arnold asked, scanning the room. "Must have been right after I radioed Christopher." For the next hour, we searched every compartment, closet, and potential hiding place on the platform. The galley, sleeping quarters, storage areas, and equipment sheds all turned up empty. Even the small motorboat remained secured to the platform, ruling out escape by water. "It's not here," I said finally, meeting Arnold back at the monitoring station. "How is that possible? There's nowhere else to go." Arnold's weathered face showed a rare glimpse of uncertainty. "I don't know, but until we find it, we maintain regular operations and follow protocols. I'll contact headquarters for guidance." "Regular operations?" I couldn't hide my disbelief. "That thing killed 3 men and is now walking around looking like one of them. We don't even know what it wants." "Which is exactly why we need to continue monitoring the buoy," Arnold insisted. "Something's changing out there. The entity's behavior is evolving and we need to track it." I wanted to argue but knew it would be pointless. Instead, I asked, "What about Henry's body?" "We'll dispose of it at first light, same as the others," Arnold replied. "Until then, Christopher stays on guard. You and I will take shifts watching the monitors. If that thing shows up again, we'll be ready." But as I took my position at the console, the empty radar screen offering no clues, I wasn't sure we'd be ready for anything. 3 men dead, a creature that could now look like us walking freely around our outpost, and no idea where it had gone or what it planned next. The laminated rule card in my pocket suddenly seemed hopelessly inadequate. I watched the sun rise through the small porthole window in the mess hall, my hands wrapped around a lukewarm coffee mug. The morning light did nothing to dispel the horror of what we'd found last night. Henry's body, withered and stuffed behind the water filtration system, was now wrapped in tarp on the lower deck, waiting for the same burial at sea that Mark and Stephen had received. Christopher had fallen asleep at the monitoring station after standing guard all night. I'd left him there, his head resting on his folded arms at the console. He needed the rest, and I needed time to think. 3 men dead in less than a week. A creature that could not only kill with a touch, but now apparently take on the appearance of its victims, and a commanding officer who clearly knew more than he was telling us. I drained my coffee and made my decision. This couldn't continue. I found Arnold in the communications room, hunched over the radio equipment with a logbook open beside him. The circles under his eyes told me he hadn't slept either. "We need to talk," I said, closing the door behind me. Arnold didn't look up. "Not now, Martinez. I'm sending a situation report to headquarters." "I don't care." I moved to stand directly across from him. 3 men are dead. That thing is still out there, probably watching us right now. I'm not doing another shift until you tell me what we're really dealing with. "You've been briefed on the protocols." "The protocols aren't working." I slammed my hand on the desk, making the radio equipment rattle. "It killed Henry and took his place. It was sitting right next to us for a full day, and your precious protocols didn't help us spot it until it was too late." Arnold finally looked up, his expression hardening. "What do you expect me to do, Martinez? Call in an evac? Abandon the mission because we've had casualties? I expect you to tell me the truth. What is that thing? What's the buoy really monitoring? Why are we here?" A long silence stretched between us. Arnold studied my face, seeming to weigh his options. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. "Lock the door." I did as he asked, turning the deadbolt with a solid click. Arnold used his key to open a metal cabinet behind the radio desk. He pulled out a thick folder stamped with red classification markers and set it on the desk between us. "Sit down." I took the chair across from him, watching as he opened the folder. Inside were stacks of papers, photographs, and what looked like hand-drawn maps. "What you're about to see is classified level 5. If you repeat any of this to unauthorized personnel, you'll face more than court-martial." Arnold's voice was flat. "Do you understand?" I nodded. "The buoy doesn't monitor weather patterns or oceanographic data," Arnold began. "It marks the location of an underwater prison, constructed over 200 years ago by indigenous tribes from islands across the Pacific." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but his face remained deadly serious. A prison for what? They had different names for it in different languages. The closest translation in English would be the Pale Woman of the Deep. Arnold pulled out a yellowed page with strange symbols drawn on it. According to their oral histories, she would appear to fishing boats or passing ships, walking on the water's surface. She would call to sailors in their own languages, lure them away from their vessels, and drag them beneath the waves. The description matched exactly what I'd seen the night Mark and Stephen died. Local tribes eventually trapped her and bound her to the ocean floor with chains made from volcanic rock and blessed by their spiritual leaders. Arnold flipped through several more pages covered with what looked like tribal artwork. For generations, they maintained the site, reinforcing the binding rituals whenever she showed signs of breaking free. "And the military found this place?" I asked, still struggling to process what he was telling me. Arnold nodded. In 1962, a submarine mapping the deep Pacific trenches for potential missile installations detected unusual readings from this location. When they sent divers down to investigate, only one returned. He pulled out a black and white photograph of a young man in a hospital bed, his eyes wide with terror. He described seeing a woman chained to the seafloor who spoke to him in his dead mother's voice. I remembered the strange, fluid language the entity had used. "She spoke to us too, but not in English. She adapts, learns." Arnold pulled out more photos. The military established the first monitoring station in 1963, a team of 6 men with orders to observe and report any unusual activity. 3 months later, they lost contact with the Outpost. The photos showed a platform similar to ours but smaller, now empty and abandoned. The next series of images made my stomach turn. Bodies laid out on metal tables, skin gray and withered just like Mark's and Stephen's. Second Outpost was built in 1976, better equipped and with strict protocols based on what they'd learned from the first disaster. Arnold turned another page. It lasted almost 2 years before it too was lost with all hands. "And we're the third," I said quietly. Platform Charlie was established in 1984, built to be more secure, with better monitoring equipment and refined protocols. Arnold closed the folder and looked at me directly. "We've maintained continuous observation for nearly 4 years. Teams rotate in and out every 6 months. There have been casualties, but until now, no complete breaches." "The rules on that card," I said, pulling the laminated card from my pocket. They were written in blood. "Trial and error," Arnold confirmed grimly. "Every rule exists because someone died learning it was necessary. Don't speak to the entity. Don't let it touch you. Don't let it into the living quarters. And if it does touch you, shoot yourself," I finished. "That's Rule 4. Arnold nodded. "Being touched by the entity doesn't always result in immediate death like what happened to Mark and Stephen. Sometimes the victim survives, but..." He hesitated, then pulled out another photograph. This one showed a man strapped to a bed, his body contorted in agony, skin stretched tight over bones but still alive. His eyes were completely black, just like the entity's. "How long?" I asked. 3 days from initial contact to complete transformation. They tried everything. Antibiotics, antifungals, even experimental treatments. Nothing worked. In the end, the victim's body dissolves from the inside out, and whatever's left. Arnold took a deep breath. They believe it becomes an extension of the original entity, a new one that can go on to infect others. I pushed the photo away, fighting the urge to be sick. "And headquarters knows all this? They keep sending people here anyway?" "What's the alternative?" Arnold asked quietly. "Abandon the site? Let the entity break free completely?" The buoy doesn't just mark the location, it contains sensors that monitor her activity levels. For decades, she only became active a few times a year, usually during storm seasons when the ocean floor was disturbed. But in the last 6 months, readings have spiked. She's breaking free more frequently, staying active longer. "Getting stronger," I said, thinking of how the creature had taken Henry's form, learning new tricks. "The ability to mimic a recently deceased victim is new," Arnold confirmed. "It suggests she's evolving beyond our current understanding." "So what's the plan? We just keep manning this outpost, losing people every few months until she eventually kills us all?" Arnold's expression didn't change. "The plan is to maintain observation and follow protocols until a more permanent solution can be implemented." "And what's that? Nuke the site from orbit?" "That option has been considered," Arnold said, so matter-of-factly that it took me a moment to realize he wasn't joking. "The problem is that we don't know if conventional weapons would be effective against her, and if they're not, we risk angering her without eliminating the threat." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process everything. So we're bait, keeping her occupied here so she doesn't head for populated areas. Arnold didn't deny it. The nearest island with permanent residents is 80 miles south, population 362. Beyond that, shipping lanes with thousands of people passing through every day. Jesus. I ran a hand over my face. Does Christopher know any of this? No, and he doesn't need to unless you think he can handle it. Some people break when they learn the full truth. I thought about Christopher's face when we found Henry's body, how he'd looked ready to run if only there had been somewhere to go. He deserves to know what he's dying for, I said finally. Arnold gathered the documents and returned them to the cabinet, locking it securely. Your call. But remember, knowing doesn't make surviving any easier. As he turned to leave, I asked one last question. How many teams have you seen rotate through here, Sergeant? Arnold paused at the door. I've been stationed here 4 times in the last 3 years, seen 12 teams come and go. And how many people made it out alive? He met my eyes with a gaze that had seen too much death. Not enough. I sat alone in the communications room after Arnold left, staring at the blank wall. The entity in the water wasn't some unexplained phenomenon or scientific anomaly. It was something ancient and malevolent, something that local tribes had feared enough to create elaborate binding rituals to contain it. And now it was getting stronger, learning to adapt, to mimic us. The platform suddenly felt impossibly small and exposed, a tiny metal island in a vast ocean with something hungry circling beneath us. I thought about the buoy with its blinking lights and hidden sensors, marking the spot where that thing was chained to the ocean floor. I imagined ancient volcanic chains corroding after centuries underwater, weakening with each passing year. I pulled out the laminated rule card again, 4 simple rules that men had died to create. They seemed woefully inadequate now that I knew what we were truly facing. I sat in the communications room for another 20 minutes after Arnold left, staring at the closed cabinet that held the classified folder. The weight of what he'd told me pressed down on my chest like a physical force. I found Christopher still asleep at the monitoring station. His face looked younger in sleep, the worry lines smoothed away. I hated to wake him, but we had work to do. "Chris," I said, touching his shoulder. He jerked awake, hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm before recognizing me. "Just me," I assured him. "We need to talk." He straightened up, blinking away sleep. "About Henry. About everything." I pulled up a chair next to him. Arnold told me what we're really guarding here. I explained what I'd learned, the ancient entity, its prison beneath us, the history of previous outposts, and the real purpose of our mission. Christopher listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from disbelief to horror. "That's insane," he said when I finished. "They sent us here to babysit some kind of, what, water demon?" Ancient entity is what Arnold called it. Indigenous people trapped it centuries ago, and now we're making sure it stays put. Christopher stood up and paced across the small room. "And those bodies? Mark and Stephen and Henry? They're just acceptable losses?" "Casualties of maintaining the observation post," I said, repeating Arnold's clinical phrasing. "So what happens now?" Christopher asked, stopping at the window to look out at the buoy bobbing in the distance. "We just wait for that thing to pick us off one by one?" "We adapt." I got up and joined him at the window. "If that thing is learning new tricks, we need better defenses." For the next few hours, Christopher and I worked to reinforce the platform's security measures. We started with the sleeping quarters, installing additional slide bolts on the inside of the doors. The toolbox from the equipment shed provided what we needed: metal brackets, screws, and basic tools. "You think a lock will stop something that can walk through walls?" Christopher asked as he held a bracket in place while I tightened the screws. "We don't know that it can walk through walls," I pointed out. "It disappeared, but that might mean it went overboard or found another exit. Until we know its capabilities for sure, we make it harder to move around the platform." We moved methodically through the living spaces, galley, communications room, monitoring station, adding locks to all interior doors. The work kept my hands busy while my mind processed everything Arnold had told me. Sergeant Arnold joined us after completing his own tasks, carrying a stack of papers. "Good initiative," he said, nodding at the new bolt we were installing on the equipment room door. "I've updated our protocols based on what happened with Williams." He handed each of us a typed sheet with new rules added below the original 4. Rule 5, I read aloud. No person shall be alone at any time. Maintain visual contact with at least one team member during all activities. Buddy system, Arnold confirmed. No exceptions, not even for bathroom breaks. You watch each other's backs at all times. Rule 6, Christopher continued. Authentication codes must be exchanged before any face-to-face interaction. Arnold pulled 2 more cards from his pocket. These have your personal authentication codes. The question is unique to each of you, something only the real person would know. I looked at my card. The question was simple. Where did you go fishing with your father? Only I would know the answer was Lake Champlain. Memorize your answer and destroy the card, Arnold instructed. If someone approaches you, even if they look like me or Martinez, demand authentication. What if they get it right? Christopher asked. That would mean it's really us, I said. But what if that thing can read minds? Christopher pressed. What if it pulled Henry's memories when it took his form? Arnold's face tightened. We have no evidence it can access memories. Williams's impostor couldn't even keep his home state straight when questioned. But we don't know for sure, Christopher insisted. No, Arnold agreed. We don't. That's why Rule 7 exists. He pointed to the paper. Any team member exhibiting unusual behavior or failing authentication must be restrained and isolated immediately. We finished reinforcing the doors, then moved on to the windows. The platform had minimal exterior windows, mainly for observation purposes, but each one represented a potential entry point. We secured metal shutters over the non-essential ones, leaving only those in the monitoring station open for necessary surveillance. While working, Christopher stayed unusually quiet. I caught him looking out toward the horizon several times, his gaze focused on the distant line where sky met water. Thinking about making a swim for it? I asked quietly when Arnold stepped away to get more supplies. Christopher gave a humorless laugh. 80 miles to the nearest island? I'd never make it. But you're thinking about it. He didn't deny it. Wouldn't you? 3 guys dead in less than a week. That thing is still out there, probably watching us right now, and headquarters won't evac us even though they know what's happening. Where would you go? I asked. The patrol boat doesn't have enough fuel to reach the mainland. I know that. Christopher tightened a bolt with unnecessary force. But sometimes I think court-martial would be better than ending up like Mark and Stephen. Arnold returned before our conversation could continue. He carried a box of emergency flares and began checking each one methodically. Even if you tried to desert, Arnold said, making it clear he'd heard us, you'd face more than court-martial. This mission is classified Level 5. Anyone who abandons their post is considered a security risk. Best case scenario, you spend 20 years in a military prison. Worst case, he left the sentence unfinished. And they'd just send replacements anyway, right? I asked. Arnold nodded. A new team would arrive within 72 hours, maybe guys who weren't properly briefed, who didn't know what they were walking into. The implication was clear. Our desertion would doom others. Christopher must have reached the same conclusion because he turned back to his work without further comment. By late afternoon, we'd reinforced every possible entry point and established clear zones of control throughout the platform. Arnold reviewed our work with the critical eye of someone who'd seen defenses fail before. This won't stop it completely, he said, but it might slow it down. Give us time to respond. I looked at the platform schematics we'd been working from. What about the underwater access points, maintenance hatches, drainage systems? Already secured years ago after the first infiltration attempts, Arnold replied. But check them anyway. The entity has shown a preference for coming above water, but that could change. Christopher and I spent another hour verifying the security of the lower-level access points. The work was uncomfortable, crawling through tight spaces, checking seals on hatches designed for underwater maintenance. Every few minutes, one of us would stop and ask the authentication question, a new habit we were drilling into ourselves. First pet's name, Christopher called out as we worked on opposite sides of a filtration tank. Rusty, I answered automatically. Street you grew up on? Maple Avenue, he replied. The constant verification was tedious but necessary. Every time Christopher disappeared from view for more than a few seconds, I felt a spike of anxiety. Was he still Christopher when he came back around the corner? Would I notice if he wasn't? When we returned to the monitoring station, Arnold was hunched over the buoy readout display, his face tight with concentration. "What is it?" I asked. "Activity spike," he replied, pointing to a graph on the screen. "The sensors are picking up increased movement around the buoy." I looked at the data scrolling across the monitor. Numbers and graphs that supposedly measured the entity's activity levels, information that had seemed meaningless before Arnold's explanation but now took on ominous significance. "What does that mean exactly?" Christopher asked, peering over Arnold's shoulder. "It means she's active again," Arnold said grimly. "Usually after a kill, she goes dormant for a few days, but this time the pattern's different. Activity levels dropped after Williams's death but started rising again within hours. Because she's learned a new trick," I suggested. "Taking Henry's form." "Possibly." Arnold pulled up previous data for comparison. The energy expenditure of maintaining a human form might require her to feed again sooner. Christopher backed away from the monitor. "Feed? You're saying it's going to try to kill one of us tonight?" "The activity pattern suggests another manifestation attempt within hours," Arnold confirmed. "Most likely after sunset. That's been the established pattern." The three of us stood in silence, watching the activity readings continue to rise. The sun was already low on the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of orange and red. We had maybe an hour of daylight left. "What's the plan?" I finally asked. Arnold straightened up. "Standard defensive posture. We maintain visual contact with the buoy at all times. Martinez, you're on radio duty. Monitor all frequencies for unusual transmissions or interference. Davis, you'll maintain visual observation. I'll coordinate our response if contact occurs." He opened the box of emergency flares he'd brought earlier. "These are magnesium flares, burn hotter and brighter than standard issue. When we faced the entity in '68, one team reported temporary disorientation of the creature when exposed to intense light. Like when I stabbed it in the eye," I said, remembering the flash of light when the woman had disappeared. "Exactly. It may be vulnerable to certain electromagnetic frequencies." Arnold distributed the flares. "Each of us carries 2 at all times. If you spot the entity, deploy a flare immediately and call for backup." The preparations continued as darkness fell. Arnold brought additional sidearms from the weapons locker and placed them at strategic points throughout our secure areas. The extra ammunition and weapons wouldn't stop the entity if bullets passed through it like before, but the routine of preparation provided a sense of control. "One last thing," Arnold said as we completed our preparations. He pulled out a small radio transmitter from his pocket. "This is a dead man's switch. If Platform Charlie goes completely dark, headquarters will assume total containment breach and implement the final contingency plan." "What's the final contingency?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Airstrike," Arnold replied without emotion. "The entire area for 20 miles in every direction gets saturated with depth charges followed by targeted missile strikes on the buoy's coordinates." "Would that even work against this thing?" Christopher asked. "Unknown," Arnold admitted. "But it's all we've got if containment fails completely." The gravity of our situation settled over me like a physical weight. We were the thin line between this ancient horror and the outside world. If we failed, hundreds of innocent people might die, either from the entity itself or from the military response to contain it. As full darkness enveloped the platform, Christopher took his position at the observation window, binoculars trained on the buoy. Its blinking red and green lights reflected off the black water, creating eerie patterns of color. I sat at the radio console, headphones on, listening to the empty static of open channels. Occasionally, I'd pick up distant chatter from cargo ships or fishing vessels passing miles away, unaware of what lurked beneath the waves near our position. Arnold moved between stations, checking readings and verifying our security measures one final time. His face betrayed no fear, only the focused determination of a man who had faced this situation before and lived to remember it. "Rules exist because they work," Arnold reminded us, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Follow them, no matter what you see or hear tonight." I thought about those 4 original rules on the laminated card, now expanded with our new protocols. Rules written in blood by men who had died learning their necessity. Men like Mark, Stephen, and Henry. What if the rules aren't enough anymore? I asked. "You said yourself the entity is evolving, learning new behaviors." Arnold met my eyes. "Then we adapt or we die. And if we die, we make sure the next team learns from our mistakes." I nodded and turned back to my radio, adjusting the frequency to scan for unusual patterns. The buoy's activity readings continued to climb on the nearby monitor. Whatever was chained beneath us was stirring, preparing to reach up from the depths once more. As I settled in for the long night ahead, I realized I'd accepted a terrible truth. I was part of something with no victory condition, no end date, no extraction plan. Just an endless vigil against something ancient and patient, something that had centuries to wait while we had only our fragile human lifespans. Our best hope wasn't to defeat it, but merely to contain it for another day, another week, another month, keeping it focused on us instead of the innocent lives beyond our tiny metal island. I checked my sidearm, adjusted my headphones, and prepared for whatever the darkness would bring. The night stretched before us, long and uncertain, but I was determined that no one else would die on my watch. Not Christopher, not Arnold, and not the hundreds of people who had no idea how close they lived to something from humanity's darkest nightmares.